Go behind the scenes of the events and issues you follow on C-SPAN with the C-SPAN Update. Designed specially for you, the Update offers articles about our coverage, profiles of Washington insiders, and program highlights every week. So call 1-800-845-9000 for your subscription to the C-SPAN Update. And as a free gift, we'll send you Gavel to Gavel, a guide to watching the House and Senate. Isn't it time you got an update?
Coming up next, we focus on Iraq's invasion of Kuwait with a discussion held by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. You will hear from, among others, Martin Indyke, Executive Director of the Institute, Barry Rubin, Senior Fellow also at the Institute, and Patrick Clausen, Resident Scholar from the Foreign Policy Research Institute. They discuss Iraq's troop strength and possible military and political strategies in the days ahead.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If I could have your attention, please. Welcome to the Washington Institute. We called this meeting, this press breakfast, at short notice in order to give a briefing by Institute experts on our assessment of the implications for U.S. policy of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. We've assembled a fairly large group of people to speak today, lest you be intimidated by the prospect of 6 academics speaking on this subject. Let me assure you that we have agreed among us that none of us will speak for more than 5 minutes in our opening statements, and I will be here to police that. And then I hope that we'll have an opportunity to explore some of these issues in the Q&A. Our first speaker today will be Seth Karras, who is now at the Naval War College Foundation on leave from the Washington Institute, an expert on the Middle East arms race. He has published in particular on Iraq's strategic weapons programs. He was, I think, the first to flag Iraq's chemical weapons programs in a policy paper that we published last year. And he has worked on those issues since, including ballistic missile proliferation in the Middle East. After Seth, who will speak about Iraq's military capabilities and what it can now do, I will call on Barry Rubin, who is our Arab Affairs Fellow at the Institute, who's a specialist on Arab issues and has written extensively on Iraq and Iran. Then we will have a briefing from Marvin Feuerwerger, our Senior Strategic Fellow, on American military capabilities and possible responses to Iraq's actions on the military level. Patrick Clausen from the Foreign Policy Research Institute, who's been a visiting fellow at the Institute here in Washington, will speak about the prospects for economic actions, punitive actions against Iraq. Then John Hanna, our expert on Soviet policy in the Middle East, will talk about the new and interesting idea of joint American-Soviet cooperation in response to Iraq's invasion. And I will conclude with some suggestions for an American diplomatic and strategic response. So, without further ado, let me call on Seth Karras.
Okay. I actually might even be briefer than the 5 minutes, because I think most of us have been over the Iraqi military so often that we probably isn't a whole lot new to say. The general outlines, I mean, are very simple. You have a very large military force with over 1 million men, not including potential reserves. This in a country of only 17 million people with a workforce, given the age breakdown of the population, that might only be 4 million people. Very large inventories of sometimes very sophisticated equipment, 6,000 battle tanks, 700 combat aircraft, large quantities of precision-guided munitions, and other kinds of some of the newer generation systems, supported by strategic weapons, including what is certainly the region's largest inventory of ballistic missiles, as well as what is now certainly the world's third largest stockpile of chemical weapons, and what at the moment is the world's largest production in place of chemical agents. For a lot of us, the events of the last 2 days were surprising in that as we looked at Iraq, we saw in place a variety of strategic weapons programs that did not look like they would be completed for a number of years, and so it made sense to us that given events of the last decade, Iraq would wait until these programs were in place before making any other kind of adventure. And here I'm primarily talking about the nuclear program that Iraq has in the works. You get various estimates of how long it will take Iraq to have their first bomb. Even the same people will give you a wide range of date figures. Some very pessimistic people, or some people in their pessimistic moments, will say 3 years. The same people might say it also could be 7 years or 10 years. But nonetheless, it's fairly clear, based on what's even known in the public sector, that at some time in the next years, Iraq will be a nuclear power. In that sense, Iraq is missing a key element of their inventory, and one that gives them weaknesses that they would not have if they had waited a few years before doing what they're doing now. My own sense of things is that Iraq will be significantly more problematic to deal with at the point at which there is one or more nuclear weapon in the country. Now, the key to looking at Iraq is not so much the inventory as opposed to how the Iraqis have learned how to make use of that inventory. As we all know, in the beginning stages of the Iran-Iraq War, the Iraqis had considerable difficulty making use of their military forces. By the end of the war, that was no longer the case, and certainly, as we saw yesterday, they're able to move reasonably large forces in an efficient manner. As a military operation, there's not much one can say about it, simply because there really was no war. I mean, the Kuwaiti military is simply not significant enough to pose any kind of serious challenge to Iraq. And that's not merely because of the disparity in size, it's also because Iraq has an army that has fought a long war and that knows what war is about, and the Kuwaitis did not. And the Kuwaiti military, in a real sense, cannot be considered a fighting army. Nevertheless, the Iraqi military does have real capabilities that pose problems, and the problem it poses for us is what it does next vis-a-vis the Saudi Arabia, which they do have a capability of striking against, and they certainly have the capability of taking the oil fields should they choose. And I mean, this will get us really to the key points, which we'll talk about later, which are the question of what the United States does vis-a-vis that. I think at this point I'll stop. Probably much more to talk about in the Q&A to follow on specific issues.
Thank you, Seth. Barry?
Good morning. I want to make 3 points today briefly. The first point is that, in my opinion, this is the most important event in Middle East politics since the 1967 war. because the 1967 war introduced Israel as a powerful force in the scene, and this changes the entire nature of inter-Arab politics and regional politics. The second point I want to make, which I think is extremely important for U.S. policy, is do not assume that the Gulf Arab states or other Middle Eastern states are going to ask, certainly doubtful or open to question whether they'll ask publicly, the United States and the West for help. And we'll come back to that. And the third point is how the Middle Eastern states view the United States. On the first point, Saddam Hussein has now changed the face of Arab politics. He broke the rules. This is, for all practical purposes, the first time that an Arab state openly, directly attacked another Arab state, much less having taken it over. This means that this becomes conceivable in the future, and that other wars among Arab states become conceivable. Now, the Middle East and the Arab world has a reputation for violence and turmoil, but that violence and turmoil has always been limited by the idea that the Arab states would respect each other's borders and would at least keep a facade of working together, of unity. This is gone, and it will not come back. The other basic point about the Middle East politics that I think has to be made is that I've heard Saddam Hussein referred to repeatedly in recent days as a pan-Arab nationalist or an Arab nationalist. If any event demonstrates that this event demonstrates that pan-Arab nationalism is dead, even if no one says it. Saddam Hussein is an Iraqi nationalist. He is building an Iraqi empire, and he did this regardless of the fact that he didn't really have any allies for this action, and regardless of the fact that it would cost him, at least with any enthusiasm, allies in the Arab world. Now, he had a choice. He could have blackmailed Kuwait. He could have said, give some of the money to my good buddies Jordan and Egypt. He could have done a lot of things differently, but he didn't, because his vision is an Iraqi-dominated Middle East, not a pan-Arab Middle East. The final point here that should be made is something about Saddam Hussein's personality. Saddam Hussein is not a crazy person. He is a person who believes in force. And his experience in the Middle East doesn't dictate otherwise. He knew that he could take over Kuwait and he could weather the storm, and I think that he will, in fact, do so. So we shouldn't misunderstand Saddam's personality. He will try to build an Iraqi empire, but he has plenty of time. He's a relatively young man. He doesn't have to do it all this week. On the second point, don't assume that the Arab states will ask the West or the United States for help. They are constrained by two things, one of which is by the shreds of pan-Arab belief. That is, you don't ask Westerners in to help you against fellow Arabs. In fact, when wanting to attack Iraq, one of the Gulf newspapers editorialized this morning, the thing we really object to in this invasion is it might bring in Western involvement, which is like the statement that certain religious denominations oppose dancing. Well, anyway, let's not get into that. I think you know the rest of it. But it's still very difficult for them to ask for Western support. The other thing is that the Gulf Arab states have historically followed the path of appeasement. They have appeased Iran, they have appeased Iraq, and they have survived. And so when the Saudis have to think, well, should we shut down the pipeline? Should we call for American help, knowing that Saddam might invade us? How is domestic public opinion going to react to it? They're going to think long and hard before saying yes. And incidentally, one thing that has not been reported in the press here is that there has been a great deal of resentment in a number of Arab countries toward the Gulf Arabs. They're seen as wealthy, indifferent to others, not giving other Arab states enough aid. And there are a lot of people in the street who say, well, this serves them right. And the final point, the attitude of the Middle East toward the U.S., very briefly, the attitude in Arab states is the Cold War is over, the United States is the sole superpower. And they say, well, what would we do if we were running the United States? We would become imperialists. They also worry that the United States will become isolationist. So they're watching to see what path the United States follows. And very briefly, I think that the countries in the Middle East can be divided into three groups. The first group might be called American allies. The most significant of these are Egypt and Israel. Egypt is the only country that can pose as a rival to Iraq for Arab leadership. Israel is a strong state that the Iraqis are very much afraid of. The second group are the Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia and the smaller states. They formed an organization called the Gulf Cooperation Council to defend themselves. They pledged themselves to come to each other's support in case of invasion. They did nothing. And again, they may well decide appeasement is the safest course. And the third group are those which we might call enemies. And the two most significant countries here are Syria and Iran. But the question has to be asked, Syria and Iran, right. No, I'm not talking about Iraq. Leaving aside Iraq. Three different kinds of Middle Eastern countries. The first are allies. I said Middle East. I said Middle East. We'll go over the tape later. The first group are friends, Egypt and Israel. The second group are the Gulf states. The third group are the states which have been enemies of the United States by their own choice, largely, Syria and Iran. These countries are not only enemies of the United States, but they're also enemies of Iraq. And are they afraid? Are they nervous? Do they want to patch up relations with the United States? This is a question perhaps not for the next week, but for the next 2 or 3 years. I'll just close by saying that in dealing with Syria and Iran, there are a lot of problems, American hostages, terrorism, and it will not be easy. It'll be up to them. If they want to do it and they want to pay a price for doing it, then that choice is theirs. This may be a development of this new era. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Barry. Marvin Forward.
Good morning. If there's one message I'd like to leave with you, it's that the United States does have military options as we look at the Gulf region. The success of those options will depend on 4 factors: what our objective might be, what time frame we're speaking about, the degree of political will in the United States, and what kind of support we can obtain from our friends and allies. On the last point, I would emphasize that the United States cannot be expected to defend people who delay their request for aid until they come under invasion. Let's look for a moment at where we stand today and at the various options. Our current forces in place in the region fall within the realm of what would be considered normal American presence. Basically, we have the Middle East force which normally has 6 ships. It now has 8 in place because 2 of them haven't been rotated out recently. We also have in the Indian Ocean the carrier battle group Independence, which has approximately 6 ships and is reported to be sailing up toward the northern Arabian Sea. The question that we have to ask as we look at military and strategic options, you can break into different time frames. What could we do in a few days to a few weeks? Basically, there are 3 kinds of things we could do. Of course, we could increase our expressions of determination, such as we're seeing today, by increasing the presence of American forces within fairly normal contours. We could strengthen our friends' ability to defend themselves if they were to request this by a variety of means, including strengthening their air defense and the like. And thirdly, were it to be decided upon, we do have military options in the near term against Iraq. These primarily fall in the realm of the use of our air and naval forces long range. They're not an option to impose large ground forces in the region, but they do pose a serious capability that could hit at Iraqi targets. In the longer run, the United States does have the capability to build up major forces in the region should it be necessary. Of course, as I indicated earlier, the degree to which we can do this will depend in no small measure on the kind of requests we have from our friends and allies. For example, if the Saudis were to invite the United States in, the United States could build up a ground and air force capability in that country, which would be no less impressive to the Iraqis than, say, the 2nd Infantry Division is in South Korea to the North Koreans. And I would emphasize here that if we think about this region over the last 30 years and how the Soviets looked at the American interest here, we have to anticipate that the Iraqis, Saddam Hussein, would assume that the Americans would defend their lifeline, their oil, no less than the Soviets had assumed we would defend our oil in the past. Looking at the issue more broadly, I would second the point that Barry made. We have here a situation in the Gulf which is abnormal. The normal balance in the region has been disrupted by Iraqi action, by the weakness of Iran in the wake of the Iran-Iraq war. And as one looks at the region, it's clearly in our interest and the interest of our friends in the region that a measure of balance be restored in the Gulf area. Obviously, we want to strengthen our friends in this region. But in addition, we should be thinking about whether there are ways to overcome obstacles with Iraq's natural foes that might help to constrain further Iraqi ambition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Patrick Clausen on the economic options.
I'd like to make 2 points this morning. The first is that Iraq did not act because it faced a cash crisis. Saddam Hussein did not invade because of fears about bread riots. So far in 1990, Iraq has paid more than $3.5 billion in debt service. That does not sound like the action of a nation with an immediate cash crisis. Indeed, Iraq's debt service payments so far in 1990 have exceeded their payments in 1989, all of 1989, by a substantial margin, and the payments have been much more than anyone expected. Iraq made in July payment on a syndicated loan without delay for the first time in, I think, some years. In 1990, unlike in earlier years, Iraq has done better on servicing its debt than the major Latin American debtors. Furthermore, Iraq's civilian imports this year are fully as high as they were in 1989. Consumer goods imports in Iraq this year are at least 25% above the 1986 low. People are not starving in Iraq. There was, however, an important economic factor behind the invasion, and that is Saddam Hussein's Nebuchadnezzar complex. Saddam Hussein wants to spend $30 to $50 billion over the next 5 years on inappropriate, large-scale civilian developments. Under his orders, Iraq's technocrats have prepared detailed plans for such large projects as a Baghdad metro, a Mosul airport, 3,000 kilometers, that's 2,000 miles of railways, 2 large hydroelectric dams, an 1,800 megawatt power station, an oil refinery, a 2 million ton iron and steel complex, a 200,000 ton aluminum smelter, a factory to make 1 million tires a year, and plus the petrochemical plant number 2, which has made news for its chemical warfare capabilities. I could keep on going and going and going. Construction of these huge projects will require vastly more than Iraq can afford. Saddam Hussein needs an income of at least $25 billion a year to satisfy his announced plans, not the $18 billion a year he could expect before the invasion. What he is after is large amounts of money, on the order of $5 to $10 billion a year additional to what he has now. Saddam Hussein is not going to be satisfied with a measly $2.4 billion as a one-time payment. His aim is larceny on a grand scale, not petty theft. I do not wish to suggest that all is well with the Iraqi economy. The man in the street is unhappy, and rightfully so. He sees billions of dollars going to inappropriate prestige developments, while consumer goods are much scarcer than before the war. Saddam has a real public relations problem about the economy. He feeds unrealistic expectations among the people, and then he follows command economy policies that keep incomes below what could be achieved. A second shorter point. The key to world oil markets remains Saudi Arabia. The Iraqis by themselves can cause only a temporary spike in oil prices. Any talk about $30 a barrel or more can only refer to those kind of temporary spikes. Iraq cannot move medium-term oil prices up by itself, or even in combination with Kuwait, because the markets know that Iraq needs oil income and cannot afford to withhold large amounts of oil for long. Any Iraqi threat to drive up prices is credible only if Saudi production is kept down. If Saddam were able to force Saudi Arabia, as well as Kuwait, to significantly curtail production over the medium term, oil prices could soar for at least 3 to 5 years. Let me be extremely blunt. If Saddam's goal is to be a key player in world oil, he needs to control the Saudi Arabian oil fields. That control, of course, could come through various means. Invasion, one of them certainly, but intimidation could be as effective. The economic incentives are very great for further Iraqi pressure on Saudi Arabia. Just as Saudi Arabia is the key to Iraqi ambitions to control the world oil market, so too is Saudi Arabia the key to any talk of an embargo of Iraqi or Kuwaiti oil. Any threat by outside powers to embargo Iraqi oil is credible only with strong Saudi support. The Saudis hold 2 trump cards. The first is the IPSA pipelines. Iraq's exports go out by pipeline half through Turkey and half through Saudi Arabia, with small amounts trucked out via Jordan and exported directly through the Gulf. Only if Saudi Arabia turns off that tap can we expect Turkey to do the same. The second trump card that the Saudis hold is that they have the spare capacity to replace Iraqi oil. The loss of Iraqi and Kuwaiti oil would mean a loss of about 4.5 million barrels a day in exports. That's 7% of world output. Such a drop could be made up if the Saudis cooperate. OPEC capacity, excluding Iraq and Kuwait, is 22.5 million barrels a day, which is the exact current level of OPEC quotas. So we could make do without Kuwaiti and Iraqi oil. But the key is the extra 2.2 million barrels a day from Saudi Arabia. Without that Saudi Arabian oil, it is not credible to speak about a medium-term embargo of Kuwaiti and Iraqi oil. With that Saudi output, we could muddle through, possibly using the Strategic Petroleum Reserve over the winter until new capacity is brought online. Let me close by saying that it is the Saudis who hold the trump cards in this current situation as far as economic response is concerned. Any decision about an oil embargo has to be made, first and foremost, in Riyadh. The United States, and indeed the West, can only act credibly if Riyadh moves first.
Thank you, Patrick. John Hanna.
I want to make three relatively brief observations about Soviet policy surrounding this crisis. The first observation has to do with Soviet attitudes and actions toward the crisis itself. There's no doubt, I think, that the Soviets were just as surprised by the actual invasion of Kuwait as everybody else, including the United States. Certainly the Soviets didn't want it to happen, given all the potential it created for instability along the border, possibly for tensions with the United States, and certainly for problems in Soviet relations with some of the local parties. Over the years, despite certain differences that the Soviets have had, especially with the Iraqis, Moscow has traditionally enjoyed relatively good relations with both Kuwait and Baghdad. Indeed, it continues to have this long-standing treaty of friendship and cooperation with Iraq. So to avoid some of these problems, we saw in the days leading up to the crisis that the Soviets were very much concerned that things were possibly going to get out of hand. And while they acknowledged the legitimacy of certain of the technical grievances that Iraq was making against Kuwait regarding oil pricing, Moscow clearly viewed the use of threats and intimidation to achieve Iraqi goals as uncalled for, and they stated quite unequivocally that any use of force to resolve the dispute would be absolutely unacceptable. So when we saw the actual invasion occur, the fact that the Soviets responded in a less enthusiastic manner really wasn't shocking. But I think what was a bit surprising, though it probably shouldn't have been, given everything that we've seen occur in Soviet foreign policy in recent years, was really the speed and the forcefulness with which Moscow reacted, as well as to the remarkable extent to which it seemed that at virtually every point along the way, the Soviets were not only acting in lockstep with the United States, but that the reaction almost seemed in some ways to be orchestrated by Washington. So what have the Soviets actually done? I think the details are pretty well known. The vote with the United States to condemn the invasion in the Security Council. Later in the day, a separate statement issued in Moscow, once again using language very much similar to that used by the White House in a statement hours earlier that condemned the invasion in very forceful terms and called for the immediate unconditional withdrawal of Iraqi troops from Kuwait. Then, of course, last night, the very significant step, the announcement by the Foreign Ministry that the Soviet Union would suspend all further arms sales and deliveries to Iraq, a step which the United States made very clear from the outset of the crisis that they were urging upon the Soviets. And then finally, of course, later this morning, I guess, just 36 hours after the crisis begins, we're going to have this unprecedented event of a U.S. Secretary of State and a Soviet foreign minister making what sounds like it's going to be a very, very tough statement of condemnation of the Iraqi action. What might the Soviets, my second point, what might the Soviets do next? I think it's very hard to predict, and it does depend to a large extent on how the crisis evolves. I think it's clear that in the short term, there's not a whole lot that the Soviets can do. It seems clear to me that their top priority is nor the power projection capabilities to bring any significant military power to bear on the immediate situation. Of course, on the arms embargo question, if it stays in effect over the long term, I think it obviously could, depending on a number of other factors, have a significant impact on Iraq and Iraq's calculations. Finally, in terms of further action with the United States, let me just say in passing, I think it's worth noting that depending on how long this crisis goes on for and the extent to which the situation in the Gulf does further deteriorate, I think the idea of an international naval force patrolling the Gulf that includes a Soviet contingent, an idea which, like a lot of ideas, sounded absolutely ridiculous and crazy just 2 or 3 years ago, at least from a political sort of strategic context, calculations of the United States, no longer sounds nearly as crazy or ridiculous. Let me leave it at that. Quickly, a few words on my third point, which really involves the larger implications of this specific crisis for this emerging post-Cold War era. It does seem to me that this event and the importance of this event, it goes beyond the security and survival of Kuwait, or even the impact on world oil markets and the international economy, as very important as all these events are. My sense is that the invasion should be seen in a much broader context as being really the first fundamental challenge to this superpower attempt of the last year to see whether they can begin building a new global order. The question really is, are the U.S. and Soviet Union and their allies in Europe going to be able to succeed in creating a new international system, one based on these new structures, this new architecture of mutual security and economic cooperation, or are the Iraqs of this world going to define what the post-Cold War world is going to look like, and using their more traditional tools of statecraft like extortion, blackmail, and military force? It seems to me that this struggle to define what the 21st century is going to look like is really the bigger issue at stake here that it's worth keeping in mind. And it seems to me that, at least from the initial reaction of the superpowers, they are in fact stepping up to Saddam's challenge. My sense is that the joint action that we've already seen will almost certainly be a spur to new forms and mechanisms of superpower cooperation in the future to prevent and manage crises in various regions. I think then it might be fair to say that if things continue as they have at the U.S.-Soviet level at least, apart from this how they impact the immediate problem of Iraqi troops in Kuwait, I think if things continue, we may all be able at some point in the future to look back on this episode as one of the first and most critical moments that really helped forge a new post-Cold War world order. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I managed to introduce everybody but myself. I'm Martin Indyk, the director of the Washington Institute, and I want to focus on U.S. policy in response to this shocking action. My first point may seem a rather obvious one, but I think it's one that has to be stressed and borne in mind and carried with us into the future here. And that is that we should have no longer any illusions about this man, Saddam Hussein. That may seem an obvious thing to say today, but it was only a few days ago that we were told by experts and others that this man was really pragmatic and wouldn't use force and was just looking for cash, etc., etc. We should understand very clearly now that Saddam Hussein and his policies present a direct threat to the vital interests of the United States in the free flow of oil to the Western Japan at reasonable prices. That has been our most important interest in the Persian Gulf, that has fostered a doctrine called the Carter Doctrine in the past, and that now requires a new Bush Doctrine that reaffirms our interest and willingness to protect that vital interest of the United States. In a sense, Saddam Hussein has done us all a favor, for he has, in this post-Cold War era, reminded us that there are still baddies and bullies around, threatening the interests of the United States and its friends, threatening the survival of weaker and small nations. And that in this post-Cold War era, the United States has to have the capability to deal with these kinds of very real threats. In terms of how this can be done, I would suggest that we need both a short-term strategy and a medium to long-term strategy. The first, obviously the short-term, has to be focused on the pressures to get Saddam Hussein to withdraw from Kuwait, and secondly, and more importantly, because the first will be extremely difficult to achieve, the second is that we have to build concerted pressure to ensure that he goes no further. In the first instance, this requires a concerted diplomatic effort with our friends and allies, and as John has suggested, we may have new allies in this effort to develop a collective response that will isolate Saddam Hussein and inflict pain, economic and diplomatic pain on him, so that he understands that there is a price to be paid for this kind of naked aggression. These efforts do stand a chance, and we should certainly insist that our allies, Europe and Japan, who have at least as much at stake as we do, stand by us in terms of the sanctions that should be imposed. One very important point here is that if we do succeed in putting the squeeze on Saddam Hussein, as Seth Karras has suggested, he can bite back. And we should be very clear about that when we plan our short-term strategy. Therefore, we have to, as a complement to this, draw the line in the sand at the Saudi border. And that depends, as Patrick Clausen has suggested, very much, and Barry Rubin also, on Saudi Arabia. For we cannot do that unless Saudi Arabia is prepared to take that stand and is prepared to ask us to help them draw that line. In terms of the longer-term strategy, it is in essence very much a development of that short-term strategy. The first and most important point is, as I said, to get behind Saudi Arabia. Because what we face here, in terms of the threat that Saddam Hussein poses to American interests in oil, is in effect a battle for Saudi oil between the United States and Iraq. For if he manages to get control indirectly or directly of Saudi oil, he will have control of 35% of the world's oil reserves, and then he really will be in a position to be the OPEC enforcer. And of course here we have a real problem, as Barry has suggested, in that Saudi Arabia is, at least for the time being, reluctant to cooperate with us in such a strategy. But that doesn't mean that that is an impossible task to get their cooperation, for in weighing up the choice between appeasement and resistance, they have to be very concerned, not just about what he did to the territory of Kuwait, but what Saddam Hussein has done to the monarch, the royal family of Kuwait. The Saudi royal family cannot have but understood the message. The second part of this strategy is to find regional ground forces for us to get behind as well. Because it's hard to imagine the political will in the United States to support serious commitment of American ground forces to an anti-Iraqi position in Saudi Arabia. We have considerable, as Marvin has suggested, considerable naval and air power that can be utilized, but we're going to need regional ground forces to play that role. And in effect, what we have to develop there is an anti-Baghdad pact, if you'll excuse the reference. In effect, we have to develop a strategy of counterbalancing Saddam Hussein's power. And we cannot do it alone. We have to depend on the countries of the region. First of all, in the first tier of this kind of response, we have to look to the countries that border Iraq. We have in them only one ally, Turkey, and Turkey is a reluctant partner in this. But if reports are true today that Turkey is considering closing its pipeline to Iraqi oil, we may in fact be pleasantly surprised by a Turkish willingness to play a role. Secondly, there is Iran and Syria. Barry has already suggested that there is a basic problem there in their anti-American policies and sentiments. But given the fact that they too face an enemy in Iraq, it is not impossible in this new situation in the Middle East that we may find a common interest with both Iran and Syria in terms of counterbalancing Iraq's power. Thirdly, we have our regional allies in the region, both of whom are formidable military powers. Egypt, a leading Arab state, has its own reluctance to commit troops against another Arab country beyond the borders of Egypt, but it can play an important leadership role in the Arab world, and we should be looking to Egypt to help in this counteracting strategy. In effect, there is a new Arab Cold War in which Iraq is competing for leadership with Egypt, and there is an opportunity here to work with Egypt in this way. And finally, with our strategic ally Israel, Israel is not about to commit its forces to the defense of Kuwait or even Saudi Arabia. But Israel too has been threatened by Iraq. Israel sees Iraq as a strategic adversary, and the strategic cooperation that we have with what is surely the most formidable military power in the region provides us with an important backup means of deterring Iraqi action. Finally, let me conclude by saying that we have to, in terms of a long strategy, find a hedge against our dependence on oil coming from this part of the world. The 1990s are predicted to be a period when our dependence on oil coming from the Gulf will go up to some perhaps 50% of our oil consumption. And this is simply not an acceptable situation. We have to find a way to develop alternative sources, to conserve energy, to go back to the policies that we took seriously in the past, but have become rather lackadaisical about in the last few years when we enjoyed a glut in the oil market. And that requires us very seriously to look again at a means of reducing our dependence on oil. Thank you very much. Let's go to Q&A. Yes, please.
Martin, to what extent the problem is Iraq, and to what extent is the problem the personage, the personal power, the personal vision, megalomania, whatever, of Saddam Hussein? And if it is the latter, could a lot be accomplished by just bumping them off?
In the late 1930s, Iraqis developed the theory that Iraq would be the Prussia uniting the Arab world around it. In the late 1960s, when Saddam Hussein's government came to power, its line was, "We are revolutionaries. We want to overthrow the reactionary monarchies in the Persian Gulf." I think that Saddam draws on a long, rich Iraqi tradition, seeing itself as the state which is going to pull the Middle East together under one regime. So it's not merely coming from him. On the other hand, and I think I should add by this that I think we should understand that Saddam Hussein is deeply entrenched in Iraq. The government is firmly in control through using both repression and rewards. Iraq has, before the war with Iran, Iraq spent its oil money pretty well compared to other states. Standard of living improved for people, and there were a lot of things put into effect to make people believe that they were better off under this regime. You were better off and you didn't want it to kill and torture you. Combination of the two ingredients. So what I want to suggest here is there is an Iraqi tradition. He has a base of support, not merely from repression. And I think that this move is going to be popular. I mean, after all, a military campaign of a few hours with hardly any casualties, which increases the size of the country, makes it powerful, makes it the country standing up to the United States, and adds a lot of oil money to it, which is going to be spent in one way or another in things which go into Iraq. Even if a lot of the spending is very ineffective, this is something that has all the possibilities of being quite popular. Having said that, Saddam is the man who makes the decisions. Saddam decided to invade Iran in 1980, and Saddam decided to do this. So it's his interpretation of Iraqi national policy and Iraqi political traditions. Saddam Hussein is in many ways a pragmatic man, but his pragmatism is in pursuit of his goal, which is Iraqi domination, not pan-Arabism. And if we understand that, a lot of it makes sense. I think it would be this man is unpredictable, but I think it would be he is not another Gaddafi. He is not crazy. He is not foolish, but he has the power to back up a lot of what he does, and that makes all the difference in the world. I think he can be persuaded by strong pressure. I mean, no one said this, and I think it's necessary to say, we all know the pattern. Everyone is outraged at this terrible action of Iraq. Everyone issues statements. A month later, people start considering their trade balances, and they start forgetting about it. And if we don't sell Iraq this weapon, someone else will, and we know the whole pattern. And so it's quite possible that if Iraq waits long enough, then all the opposition will just dissipate, and they'll get away with it. This is the key policy point that has to be made now. This cannot be allowed to happen, because Saddam will go further in the future.
I just want to add one thing on this question of Saddam Hussein's character and whether he's crazy, insane or not. To suggest to you that the kind of deception that he was able to carry out in the Iran war may in fact have taken place here as well. That is, the threats against Israel may well have been a feint, a means of ensuring that he would get the commitment from Israel, which he did get, that Israel did not intend to attack him, and may have indeed been intended as a means of shifting the focus and our understanding of his strategy away from what now appears to be his real game plan. And I would not underestimate the fact that this is a plan that had been developed in stages over the last 6 or 7 months. Yes, could you identify yourself, please?
Harold Carey with Oil Around News. The 100,000 Iraqi troops which were at the Kuwait border a couple of days ago are now at the Saudi Arabian border. Does he really have to cross that line to get the coerced Saudi cooperation? Following on that, I wonder if someone could talk about the Saudi Arabia's military capacity right now. And also, do we have to accept the fact that Iraq is in Kuwait to stay and will control that oil resource?
Right. You want to answer on the first, on the Saudi?
There's a good one-sentence answer to that, which is it's up to the Saudis. The Saudis know where his troops are. Apparently, Saudi Arabia has not mobilized its forces, as far as I know. So the Saudis know that if they call for outside help, close down the pipeline, or take certain other actions, then he could cross the border. I don't think he intends to now, but he has that. And since Saudi Arabia is the key country, this threat may be able to neutralize any opposition to what Iraq has already done. Will Iraq stay in Kuwait? I think that to a large extent that depends on what the rest of the world does. And if the rest of the world forgets about this and doesn't do anything about it, then of course he'll stay there. If the rest of the world doesn't, then he may be pushed out. I think, one more sentence, I think that what the Arab world is doing is they are, on the one hand, they are testing this question. On the other hand, they're continuing their policy of appeasement. So what they're going to do is for a few days and maybe for a few weeks, they'll try to mediate, negotiate, and try to get him out. The issue is what happens if they decide that that's not working? What will they do then?
And I think in that regard, the key is that if they see that there is a concerted international response that's prepared to back them up, they may have more backbone than if they have the sense that there really isn't a great deal of support out there for a policy of resistance. Seth, you want to answer on the Saudi military capability?
Well, the basic bottom line is that the Saudis do not have the ability to independently resist Iraq. They have spent a lot of money on defense. They have a lot of impressive equipment. But in a sense, they're in exactly the same position Kuwait was. It's a facade of a military force that really was never intended to fight a war, that perhaps could do more than the Kuwaitis did, but the ultimate conclusion would be no different.
Tom Friedman?
Patrick, you pointed out the key swing role that Saudi Arabia plays in here. I wondered if you could just elaborate on that a little bit and talk about what you think will be the Saudi calculation as they, encounter this challenge now. What will they be looking at economically, politically, militarily?
The Saudis have a long history of responding to threats, problems, through bribery. And I think they feel that that policy has been quite successful. And I see little reason to believe, from the events of the last 24 hours, that their impulses will be any different on this matter. I would say that, however, that if the Saudis are going to take any firmer action, that they would certainly spend several days canvassing the world, the Arab world at first and foremost, but also the broader world, to see what the reaction would be. And therefore, I would not anticipate that we're going to see any vigorous Saudi response in the next 24 hours. It would come only through time. But I'm quite sure that the Saudis are using various intermediaries to sound out Saddam Hussein to see what exactly it is that he wants. How large a bill would they have to pay? I frankly am not sanguine about limiting Saddam Hussein's demands to something which even the Saudis can meet. Don't forget that Saudi Arabia, unlike Kuwait, has a large budget deficit, has run down much of its foreign exchange reserves, and is not in a position to meet Saddam Hussein's demands at its current oil production levels without having to cut back on domestic programs that have been vital for the support of the support by the population for the royal family. They're much more vulnerable in that way than Kuwait was.
Yes.
This is a kind of follow-up on Mort Conrad. What will it take in the way of assurances from us and others to get Saudi Arabia to be willing to raise its oil production and in other ways stand up to Iraq?
Well, I think I alluded to it in the answer to the earlier question, which is, I think the most important point is that the Saudis have to be convinced that we are indeed going to stand by them. Their instinct is to do the opposite, is to put their head into the jaws of the lion in the hope that he won't close them. But they've got to have real doubts about the possibility that he will close them. So I think they've got to be weighing it up in their minds. The key thing that will affect their calculus is our reliability. And I think that we have to be very firm and very clear in that if we're going to have a hope. If they do that, I mean, there are a number of important points that we can take advantage of here. The Saudis have been overbuilding their facilities, their air bases in particular, for precisely this kind of crisis. And of course was built by the American Army Engineer Corps, and I mean they are built in a sense to our specifications. Were we to be able to move in there to fortify the Saudis in physical ways, we too would in a sense become an oil power, and we would be in a much better position to counter Iraq's strategy via Saudi Arabia. So there's a great deal at stake in Saudi Arabia. We have a great interest in backing them up now, but I would not at all be sanguine about our chances unless they really see that those jaws are going to close on them. And I think that there's an Iraqi diplomat going to Saudi Arabia today. I think they would like to find out from Iraq just whether they can get some kind of assurances that this isn't going to happen to them. That would be their first preferred way of doing business. Yes, please, Rami.
You have omitted,
Speak up.
You have omitted Jordan, King Hussein, from the list of potential allies to the West. Was that intentionally? Do you think he is lost as an ally because of his relations with Saddam Hussein? Or do you think there is a chance to get back Hussein to the West?
I think it's a mistake to assume that these things are on-off, like light switches, and they're either on or they're off. I mean, I want to stress something here that that the Iraqi forces in Kuwait could line up a dozen Islamic clerics and a dozen Arab writers and a dozen respected intellectuals and shoot them on television. And a lot of people in the Arab world would still say this is terrible, but it would be even worse if we let in outside intervention. And he has this factor on his side. And as far as King Hussein goes, Jordan has made itself the closest Arab ally of Iraq. It is in no way under Iraqi control. It is not an Iraqi puppet. It doesn't intend to be an Iraqi puppet. But they have to be very careful. This puts them in a terribly difficult position. And they are not going, I don't think, to stick their necks out on this issue. They are afraid of Saddam, but Saddam is their friend. Maybe Saddam will give them something out of this. I just do not see Jordan playing a major role on this issue. Jordan is a weak country surrounded by strong countries. It is not going to play a leadership role privately. They'll go to Baghdad. They'll talk to the Iraqi government. They'll say, can we mediate this? Can we patch this up? But they are not a primary factor in this equation.
I'll just add one thing that reports I have this morning is that the king is indeed shaken up by what has happened. But the Jordanians in particular were the ones who were busy putting a very civilized face on Saddam Hussein, and they have been his greatest defenders and promoters in the West in recent months, and for that reason they are particularly shaken up by his actions. But as usual in this part of the world, there's a distinction between private reactions and the public face. Please, Bernie Cowell.
Running through these observations has been what role the United States could play to build a sense of a barricade against further expansion by Saddam Hussein. On the basis of your sensitivities with this subject, what is Saddam Hussein's perception of the United States, of President Bush, in what is widely being described as President Bush's first foreign policy crisis and challenge?
I think that's a fascinating and extremely important question. First of all, the way I would put it is that Saddam has been testing the waters, that his threats to Israel, that his earlier use of chemical weapons against the Kurds, and other factors, each time he's tested before he's taken the next step forward. And having found himself able to get away with it, he has taken the next step forward. But I think we often fail to understand that the secret and greatest weapon of the United States in the Middle East is that people in the Middle East, even today, in my opinion, overestimate American power. They don't underestimate it. The way they look at it is, the Cold War is over, the United States won. The United States is the most powerful country in the world. If the United States chooses, it could do anything it wants. And it could change the face of the region. Now, we underwent an experience with this with Iran, that after the Iranian Revolution, there was a great deal of fear about the United States overturning the revolution. It could do anything. And through the hostage crisis, the Iranians at least temporarily overcame that, and in the famous words of Ayatollah Khomeini, which became one of the main Iranian slogans of the time, the United States can't do a damn thing. But he kept telling this to the Iranians, and when he died, they went back to their old belief in the power of the United States. In my opinion, Saddam Hussein believes the United States is extremely powerful. He is afraid of the United States. He is afraid of the United States attacking him. One could go on in great detail and give examples of this. And therefore, I think that a strong and continuing American reaction can have an effect. Now, the The United States adopted a largely correct policy, in my opinion, in the 1980s, supporting Iraq against Iran. But when the circumstances changed, the U.S. reaction to that change was very slow and very soft. A few days ago, a member of the American cabinet was arguing against Congress's passing legislation to cut off the U.S. agricultural credits to Iraq. High-ranking people in the administration argued against a tough policy towards Saddam Hussein, and he took account of that. It is not too late. If the Bush administration really puts this at center policy, tries to organize and lead international efforts, many of which are going to be economic and diplomatic, it isn't too late to convince Saddam he's up against the United States, a country which has nuclear weapons and large numbers of troops and great power and is always conspiring. And even if that belief is overstated, it can be used as leverage against him. But if he's convinced that the United States is a paper tiger, or to revise an Iranian phrase, a paper Satan, then he will proceed accordingly.
If I may have one point on this. Obviously, we can't read Saddam's mind. If we look at what he said publicly in his efforts to stir up opposition to the United States, he has made the claim the United States was a paper tiger. He cited the situation in the United States and Lebanon. And I would submit that what he's done here in Kuwait has demonstrated contempt for American power. However, Barry is correct. He still recognizes that American power. And if we were to demonstrate that in a persuasive way to him, he has left himself the possibility of still withdrawing from Kuwait, and he does have the capacity to still be flexible in response to an exercise of American power.
What kind of suggestion do you have in terms of what the Americans should do to convince Saddam Hussein that the Americans are ready to act or will take a stand?
I think that initially that the political, diplomatic, economic measures are the wisest course, in part because we don't have a good situation on the ground in the region. I think that, as Martin has indicated, though, should Saddam choose to expand his aggression beyond where he is today, that the United States will have to demonstrate to him persuasively, militarily, that this is a very unwise action.
Let me just follow up on this suggestion that he might, in fact, withdraw, and we should not dismiss that possibility. But that is contingent upon him putting what he calls a friendly regime in place. And one of the things to notice at the moment is that there is no face to this friendly regime that the Iraqis are talking about. They have not recruited anybody. And that suggests that he's having trouble. So it may not be so easy for him to pull out. It's also worthy of note, just in terms of short-term things, that Saddam Hussein himself has not appeared on television, which could be interpreted as a suggestion that he doesn't see this as a closed case yet. It's not over for him. Yes, please. David Twersky.
With all due respect, it sounds to me like you're saying, I don't want to say that there's a collective wisdom here, but to the degree that there is, let's let him get away with what he's gotten away with already. The possibilities of stopping him or mobilizing power on the ground are very, very limited. Let's draw a line in the sand against further expansion. Is there any way to roll back what has happened?
Of course. I mean, you know, I think we have to clarify our distinction here between military and other efforts. I think what we're saying is a point of fact is that the United States is not going to become militarily involved as long if Iraq stays in Kuwait and doesn't advance. I think that's a point of fact. However, we can give a long list of other measures taken, including arms embargo, oil embargo, trade embargo, freezing bank loans and credits, mounting an international diplomatic campaign, getting Arab states to condemn him and to isolate him, strengthening U.S. alliances with the Arab world, strengthening U.S. alliances with Israel. There is a whole range of measures that could make life very difficult for him, and that is the way to try to get him to move back north across the border in exchange for large amounts of money and other things. But I think we also want to make it clear that we are not advocating, nor, I mean, I think as analysts we expect that the United States is going to send military forces in now. I don't think that's really likely. Although President Bush should continue to leave open the idea because they have to be able to think in Baghdad that it might be possible as a means of additional pressure.
I think it's very important to understand that Kuwait's territorial integrity and independence is an international concern, as demonstrated by the Security Council's condemnation and demand for its withdrawal. It's not just an American concern. It's an international concern, and that's the way it should be treated, with diplomatic and economic efforts to get him to pull out. Where our interests are directly affected is when it comes to where he might go further. And in terms of any kind of discussion about American boys dying, I think we have to accept that there's a certain fait accompli that has occurred with Kuwait, and that to roll that back, the correct methods are political and economic, and that the military requirement is when it comes to, as I said, drawing the line in the sand at the Saudi border. That's where our interests become directly impacted. Yes, please. Could you identify yourself?
Roland Dallas. You discussed the United States, the possibilities the United States could have in dealing with. You haven't gone into other Western countries, European countries, Japan, for example. These have got, in particular, Italy and France have got strong trading relationships with Iraq, and I think Japan buys a lot of Iraqi oil. How are you going to turn around these countries? And what is feasible in this context?
First, you're quite correct that the European countries and Japan have larger economic interests in Iraq than the United States does. Well, excuse me, as large economic interests in Iraq as the United States does. And indeed, France is an important arms supplier to Iraq. So that the role of the European countries and the role of Japan are crucial. But look, if we're talking about forming international consensus, I think that there's no question that the role of the European countries is vital. If we're talking about economic sanctions, what really counts is Saudi Arabia. That is the country that really matters in the situation, not the European or Japanese powers. If we're talking about military force, I think it would be, personally, that it would be very useful for political reasons, if nothing else, to have a multilateral force. But if we recognize the limits the United States has in getting its forces into the area, all the more so for most of those other powers. So what it is that the United States should ask those countries to do, the European countries, I would say the United States should ask them to vigorously condemn the Iraqi action, to help form that consensus of the world community. So that, as Martin said, it's not the United States versus Iraq, it's the world community versus Iraq. But concrete measures that we can ask them to take over and above, assisting us with the freeze in assets, assisting us with economic sanctions, I don't think that that's the key to resolving this problem.
But it's of course very useful and important in resolving it.
It's very useful and important to have that support, absolutely. If the issue is portrayed as the United States versus Saddam Hussein, then it seems to me we have lost a very important propaganda battle.
Yes, please.
You talked a good deal, however, about Middle East nations appeasing countries like Iraq. Well, the history of so have European countries. Therefore, given what you said, how confident are any of you that they will be steadfast if in fact they make the initial, what you consider appropriate response?
As I say, we have, as you pointed out, seen a pattern in the past. The world was able to mount a certain amount of pressure against Iran during the Iran-Iraq War. It didn't lead to an immediate end in the war, but it was fairly effective. And of course, the state which violated it most egregiously, could be argued, was the United States, violating its own policy. I think it could go either way. It depends. We are in a new era. This is the new 1945. We have, as John pointed out, opportunities to build an order, an international order for peace. And we don't know exactly how people will react. But I think it's a very large possibility that after a month or so, or 2 months, people are going to look at their import-export balances and say, this is a fait accompli, and we're going to live with it. I think that would be a disaster. So what we have to do now, in conjunction with the European countries and England and France, and in particular are important in this, to try to counteract that starting today. Even in the U.S. Congress, we have to raise questions. It would probably be easy to get through a vote for sanctions today, but what about in 2 or 3 months if the Iraqis say we want to continue buying large amounts of American wheat and things like that? So you have to start now. You have to have presidential leadership in the United States, and you have to make this an absolute policy priority.
Just a quick comment. May I point out that when there was all the concern about the Iraqi supergun, the cooperation from among European states was really rather remarkable. And we saw countries like Greece and Spain, which have not been noted in the past for their strong stance on export controls, really reacting quickly and reacting to what was partial and fragmentary information by blocking shipments. So I think that the events of this last spring demonstrate that there is a European concern about Iraqi interests that we could tap into and mobilize.
Just to add one quick point that others have made, but as Patrick indicated, Saddam has very ambitious plans. His ability to deliver on those plans does depend directly on his relationship with European countries and the United States. And I think that by acting very directly, they can influence his calculus about his ability to deliver the goods to his own people.
I just wonder, I mean, the reaction is to a military action, which the world usually does react to forcibly. I mean, he can, point I tried to make earlier, he could now sit back on the Saudi border, call the shots, not have to send any troops in, and achieve his aims, and therefore will the world's attention sort of drift away and accept it as a fait accompli.
Well, as Barry says, is presumably his strategy. That doesn't mean that collective will is impossible, and I think the emphasis that we're trying to make here is that it's very important to try. But as I tried to suggest, we also need a strategy for countering his power, and that requires working with the considerable assets we have in the region in terms of friends who do have backbone and others who also have backbone and who have the potential to become friends in this situation. And that is the most important point here. Iraq, our traditional policy in the Gulf is to play the balancer between Iraq and Iran. When Iraq was previously powerful and threatening, we supported Iran. When Iran, revolutionary Iran, became powerful and threatening, we tilted towards Iraq. Ideally, we would now tilt back towards Iran. But given the policies of the Iranian government and given its weakness in this current situation, that isn't a very good strategy. So we have to find alternatives. And there are alternatives around in the form of the countries that I've suggested: Egypt, Israel, Turkey, and Syria, if Syria is prepared to change its own attitude and policy. Maud.
Concretely, what is it that we're supposed to do with Syria, Iran, and Egypt? And secondly, does the situation require that there be some sort of a multinational air force or something arriving quite soon in Saudi Arabia in order to present a physical barrier against the possibility of an invasion in the next week or so before all this gets organized, insofar as everybody understands that Saudi Arabia is the key to this next strategy?
Well, perhaps others will want to comment, so I'll just speak very briefly. In terms of multinational forces, I think it's makes much more sense to organize multinational naval forces than a multinational air force coming into Saudi Arabia. We want to get our air power in there if the Saudis will invite us. That will give us an important base that we haven't had in the past for countering Saddam Hussein. There may be a prospect for some kind of international peacekeeping force that should at least be created, perhaps with US-Soviet participation, as a means of putting further pressure on Saddam to get out of Kuwait. And we put a UN-type peacekeeping force in there with American and Soviet forces involved. I think that is a good idea to move ahead on now, just as a symbolic action, that there is an alternative there as a way of increasing the pressure on him to withdraw. In terms of what we ask Egypt to do, as I said before, we've got to have some ground forces. We've got to have a talk with Egypt about the question of ground forces. I'm not very optimistic there, but Egypt is a formidable power in the region. It plays a leadership role and would be prepared I think, to play a protective role of weaker Arab states, but it's also very reluctant to get involved in a war with another Arab country or commit its forces beyond Egypt's borders. So there's a problem there, but we certainly should be talking to the Egyptians about this. With Israel, it's strategic cooperation. It's the kind of visits that the Israeli defense minister paid here to talk about Iraq a week and a half ago. Those kinds of things send a signal. After all, Saddam Hussein supposedly fears an Israeli attack, and that can be a helpful backup in terms of affecting his calculus about what we might be doing. As far as Syria is concerned, if the Syrians were to mobilize on their border with Iraq, that would get Saddam Hussein's attention in short order. Indeed, their forces, I believe, are on alert, but they have not reinforced them yet. But the Syrians can only do that if they move their forces either out of Lebanon or away from the Golan Heights. And there would have to be some understandings there, perhaps brokered by the United States, in order to make that possible. And this may be far-fetched speculation, but out of that you may in fact get a changing circumstance in the Arab-Israeli arena.
Can I say something?
Seth wants to. Let's have Seth first.
Yeah, let me just make one comment to extend these remarks, and that is, the more effective the economic and diplomatic sanctions are against Iraq, I think the greater the risk that there will be a subsequent use of force. If, in fact, we're able to prevent him from reaping the benefits of seizing Kuwait, if he's not able to export his own oil, he has an incentive, which I think would be very strong, to basically gather in the whole, control the whole ball game by going into Saudi Arabia. So that we have to anticipate that if in fact these non-military moves that we make are successful, that the chances of confrontation may still actually be higher than they are today. And we have to be prepared for it.
Yes, we did.
There's been lots of talk about the need for ground forces if you're going to oppose Saddam Hussein in Kuwait. I don't understand why that would be necessary if you just couldn't use air power to make a few good strikes, airstrikes against Iraqi forces in Kuwait as a warning, as a signal, if you will, for them to move out. Why couldn't that be possible? The staging areas for airstrikes are all over the place, as long as you have the refueling capability, which the Americans have and the Russians have, you could put carriers off the Med, outside the Persian Gulf. You could put refueling planes in Sinai, Egyptian bases in Sinai, Israeli bases, et cetera, et cetera.
I stress the United States has the capability, if it were to choose to do so, to punish Iraq militarily. There's no doubt about that. In terms of actually forcing militarily Iraq to withdraw from territory that it currently occupies, in the last analysis, it requires ground forces because only ground forces can hold territory. We're not advocating military action at this time, but it's clear that you are correct, that Saddam is not immune from American power were the United States to choose to exercise that power.
I just want to make two brief points I think are extremely important. First of all, the states of the Middle East are countries, not colonies. Their divisions and army corps are not going to be disposed of by the United States. They have to decide what to do, and first and foremost, Saudi Arabia. And if the Saudis, I don't believe the Saudis are going to decide they want Western forces in there. They might, for example, ask for a multinational Arab force along the border with relatively small numbers of troops from different Arab countries, which would be a tripwire to discourage an Iraqi attack. That would be a viable option, for example. The other thing is, very briefly, what has U.S. policy been? We remember that President Carter enunciated what became known as the Carter Doctrine, that if outside forces intervened in the region, this would be a cause for U.S. response, referring to the Soviet Union. Then we got the Reagan Doctrine, in which he said we will not allow Saudi Arabia to become another Iran. The question is, will we have a Bush Doctrine which says we will not allow Saudi Arabia to become another Kuwait? Will there be clear statements by the U.S. government of drawing the line? Remember that many people attribute the North Korean invasion of South Korea to the fact that there was no clear American commitment to defend South Korea in 1950. This now becomes a question in terms of Saudi Arabia. And by merely making a major policy statement to this regard, parallel to the Carter and Reagan statements, I think this would do a great deal more than moving around all sorts of airplanes to show Iraq what the cost would be for further advance.
John, do you?
Let me just make a point, because it's getting very lonely. I mean, these days, being a Soviet expert, I think it's indicative of I guess a larger point that nobody really cares anymore, which I suppose in some ways is good, except for us that actually study the subject. I just wanted to make a point on this. What do we do with Iran and Syria, and throw out another idea that certainly would have seemed quite crazy just a few years ago. But it does strike me in a situation where the United States is under sort of extreme political constraints to make any significant moves towards both these countries at a time when you really need to play the realpolitik game of trying to balance off a hegemonic Iraq, that there are some possibilities and opportunities with both the Syrians and the Iranians